Welcome to today's webinar entitled Designing for Human Behavior Through Innovative Furniture Solutions. My name is Billy Zadig, Manager of Special Programs for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to the APA webpage under the Continuous Learning tab later today. Professional continuing education certificates are being offered for today's program. Those who indicated they wanted a certificate at registration and meet the requirements will receive certificates later this afternoon. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we still have questions, responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by our presenter. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Joe Agati, our speaker for today's webinar. Joe, take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, Billy. And thank you everybody for joining today. And we're going to be talking about designing for human behavior. My name is Joe Agati. I am one of the owners of Agati Furniture. It's a family-owned company. My father started it almost coming up on 35 years ago. So it's exciting. It's something I've kind of always wanted to do here. I've just actually celebrated my 11th anniversary with Agati Furniture. So just before we get started, I want to give everybody a background into me. My kind of education comes from product design, product development. So I went to University of Illinois and I have a degree in industrial design. And that is not designing factories. I used to get that question a lot. I think more people are familiar with industrial design, but it's what we call designing for industry. So it's a really fun degree because you can kind of go into any avenue. As I'll show you here in a minute, I started off my design career in toy design. Wasn't necessarily planned, but it was a great happy accident. But you can go into any kind of element. I have people that do user interface design. I have friends that have gone on to do medical device, packaging, point of purchase. Like it's a very wide kind of breadth of a degree there. So like I said, I started, advancing here. I started my career off with Radio Flyer. They're most known for their red wagons. They're based here in Chicago like we are. They're on the west side of the city. Awesome company to work for. Similar to us, family owned, a bit bigger than we are. A family owned company. I work for the third generation, the grandson of the founder of Radio Flyer. They celebrated their 100th anniversary a little, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And one of the great things about working there for me, beyond the company culture, great organization, they shared a similar passion and approach to design that I have, and I come to realize later in life my father had too. It's really coming from observing human behavior and trying to find, as Radio Flyer would call it, those key consumer insights. Internally we call them key user insights, and trying to find ways to innovate off of that. So while I was there, I worked on a variety of different products. I spent most of my time on the trike and ride-on team. I did work on a wagon project. And every one of these here, and one of those products you see here, was designed for watching children at play or watching a children and adults interact with the product and saying, how can we make this better? How can we solve a problem for somebody? So the wagon that you see up in the corner here, after going to the zoos and parades and trying not to be super creepy, like taking pictures of random children and families interacting with products and wagons, but noticing that, like, hey, people are always bringing a lot of stuff with kids. Now, I was there in my 20s, pre-children, so I didn't have as great of appreciation of the amount of stuff that children come with, but realizing that, how do we make this experience better? We know wagons will take kids to fun, and kids associate that. Like, kids will gladly sit in the wagon, and they're a little more fussy when they sit in the strollers. So how do we increase that experience for both child and adult? And it's kind of obvious, like, well, there's a lot of real estate in the back of the wagon. What if we just put a bag back there and make it really functional for the parent and the child? So the child can go into it, kind of creates like kind of a play pattern for them. Parents can store either cold or wet things, dry things in the bag, and it all folds up in the back. So again, coming and looking at it from that kind of human behavior perspective and finding that key consumer insight. Same thing with the trike down here, watching children get it on and off of tricycles, especially at a young age. They're great ways to learn how to start pedaling, build your proprioception skills, muscles, things like that. But trikes with a high seat are inherently unstable. And so some kids pick it up real fast, some kids don't. So watching kids trying to get it on and off, try tipping over, falling, making it difficult for them. Hey, let's lower this thing to the floor. We can stretch the trike in and out. Actually, that thing telescopes in there to help grow with the child, put their legs more in line with the pedals. So they're still learning the pedal motion, but it's a little more natural for them. Again, coming up with a solution based on those human behavior kind of innovation points in there. So Agati has a similar story to Radio Flyer. Like again, we started in 1986. My dad started on his own right after college, but the company wasn't founded until 1986. And each one of the products here, some clearly more innovative than others, but all kind of stemming from like, how do we find a way to innovate based off of what we're seeing in the environment? So the early stages when all libraries wanted to be, floor of like the same style, arts and crafts style of furniture, all wood, very what we'd consider traditional. But wooden library chairs were uncomfortable. Well, they don't have to be. Just because it's a wood chair doesn't mean it's uncomfortable. It's kind of just a baseline here to guide. We don't make uncomfortable chairs. So Joe Senior realizing like, hey, if we just change the pitch a little bit, change this, change that, because we're kind of shifting, there's reading, and especially like as we got in the 90s, there's reading such computer work coming up. So it's a little change in work pattern, putting a lumbar. So doing the steam bent back, again, not incredibly revolutionary, but a big deal, making that wooden library chair comfortable for people to sit in for hours. And so every one of the products as you see online has a similar story to that. Especially we'll talk a little bit more about this Carolyn here, but all coming from observing human behavior and trying to find those key user insights in there. And so not for the sake of repeating myself. So what are we going to talk about today? Again, human behavior. This is kind of the fundamental place to start when you're thinking about a space, thinking about what do I want to achieve? What do I want to do? Is always starting kind of from the human perspective. So why do we care about this? Well, mental health and wellness are important. And I think, when I first started giving this presentation, especially, several years before the pandemic, you kind of had to sell people a little bit more on like, hey, it's important that you should kind of care about how people think about your space, what their emotional kind of interaction is going to be with the space, how it could have an impact on mental health and wellness. That was like a new concept that you're kind of trying to explain to people and the importance of it. Obviously, as we've gone on post-pandemic, a silver lining of it has given us a greater appreciation of how much space people like, the understanding of that kind of, these spaces can be these sanctuary spaces that make us feel comfortable. And what do we need to do in there to try to accommodate that? So it's less of a concept that we have to explain, but it's important. And, your furniture in the space plays a role in that. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to get to this place of peace of mind. And so I use Maslow's hierarchy of needs to try to help build some of the kind of what we're talking about here. So Maslow's a sociologist from the 40s and 50s that created this hierarchy of needs, and you start off at the bottom with your psychological needs. You need food, water, warmth, rest, and you kind of move up, the pyramid here: safety, security, all the way up to self-actualization. And it's broken up into like 3 buckets here. You got your basic psychological needs and your self-fulfillment needs. And usually where I like to start off is like, if we're not kind of hitting the bottom of the pyramid here, or not hitting, kind of the basic needs, we're never going to be able to move up in here. So we really need to kind of understand where we're coming from, in our kind of root selves. And so if we think about that, where did we start from? Well, we've evolved from living in a forest and a jungle. We started gathering in groups, moving inside to caves or shelters. And why do we do that? Well, somehow our species was able to survive doing that way. So we, these types of spaces provided us warmth. We could have our food and protect ourselves, spreaded safety and security. Again, this all meant our survival. This is how we have evolved over time. And so if you guys are familiar with biophilia, I'm not sure I heard that term before. There's 15 points of biophilia, and it talks about, 2 of them being, one being refuge. So we are hardwired to seek out refuge. And we are hardwired to want to have prospect, as they call it, or be able to survey our environment. So these two things were kind of like, again, built out of our evolutionary survival. So we're kind of hardwired to either seek out these places or have the ability to witness or try to have understanding of our space so we can, prevent danger from coming and getting us. So we think back to our caveman brethren days, and what was going on? Well, we had stressors, and stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. Again, it ties to our survival, but there are things like predators, maybe people we don't know, that would trigger stress. And so what does stress do? It's a chemical response to something, adrenaline, cortisol. That starts rushing into the body. It's your fight or flight response. And again, not to keep repeating myself, this would meant our survival. This is how we perpetuated that. We would get this burst of chemicals and we could run away or we could fight off what we needed. The challenge is in our kind of more modern human brains, stress can be triggered by a lot of things. Things aren't life-threatening. Like back to the caveman days, those were life-triggering stressors. Well, they feel like life-threatening, but they're really not. So our body evolutionarily is not able to handle kind of the constant stress. Again, you got the adrenaline, cortisol, where we weren't supposed to be having stress responses as much as we were. And like I said before, stress isn't a bad thing. Stress can be a motivator at times, but not all the time. All the time, then it becomes a detriment. And so I use, again, being from the toy background, I use kind of the fort play with children. If you look, anybody that has children or nieces or nephews or anything like that, they like to build forts. Well, why do they like to build forts? Think about the world from a child's perspective. Everything's too big, too heavy, too tall, too difficult. Like it's a very overwhelmed, too loud. I didn't have such of appreciation. I kind of remembered it now as my kids be like, oh, that's so loud. I'm like, that's not that loud. But yeah, but I'm like 40 and I have 40 years of hearing damage or whatever. Kids' hearing is all new. So everything's loud, overwhelming. It's overly stimulating. And anybody that's had a child that's like in the middle of a temper tantrum, like you can't talk to them. Their brain is like cooked. Like they're just like, it can't function. Um, so what do? Like they like to create their own spaces. I was a fort kid, probably not surprising to anybody. I made a lot of forts growing up. Um, but we're hardwired to kind of seek out these comfortable spaces. Again, it's survival. And think about a fort. It's like the ceiling's lower, usually using it like with blankets. So it's just like warm, comfort feeling. In there, it's kind of like everything's down at my level, or at a child's level in there. And again, as a survival, we're kind of like hardwired to seek these spaces out. So we think about that, like that has happened over a long period of time. We have evolved over a vast period of time. When we think about things around us, like technology, like this is a snapshot from, 15 years, 2001, 2016. Look how fast, technology has evolved. And, I haven't even taken it on to 23. And now we've got emergence of AI and things like that. Things around us do change very rapidly. How we communicate. I remember the days of AOL dial-up internet and, the beep, bop, brr, and, you paying for internet by the minute. I mean, it's like trying to explain that to my kids now and their heads explode. But how we communicate with each other has evolved so rapidly in such a short period of time when you think of like how humans have evolved. So again, this time kind of plays a factor in there, and sometimes it can kind of mislead us. And so let me give you an example here. So I use this a lot because it's just really good. 2 snapshots in time, 10 years apart, especially when outside circumstances have been evolving around us. So you've got University of Florida and you have North Park University here in Chicago, 10 years apart. So if you look at, what's changed, well, technology changed like 2006, 2016, like there were massive changes. I graduated in 2006 and I did have a laptop, but it was very common. I would have to go to the computer lab to run all the CAD and rendering, all like high-end softwares that, laptop could never run it in that day. Now it's like, students have a laptop, they have a phone, they may have a tablet, or tablet and phone or something. They have at least one, if not multiple devices. 2006, it was common to go to a library to access technology, like a computer and things like that. So the technology has changed over time. But look at how people sit. I remember in 2006, everybody saying there's going to be no more paper in 10 years. everything's going to be digital. Oh, we get rid of the paper. You know how many universities I walk into and it's just a sea of books and paper sprawled out on tables with the laptop or with the phone or something. So if you look here, the book's still there. The book's still there. Where does everybody sit? Right in the middle of the banquette. What do they do to protect their space? They put their bag next to them. All these things have changed around us for a long period of time, but our behavior, the things that make us feel comfortable, make us feel secure in the space, has not. So that's why I like to use this just to try to illustrate. You will have those outside influencers, but really behavior doesn't really move the ball much. So why else do we care about this? Well, when we can understand what we're trying to achieve in a space, the behavior that we're trying to either guide towards or build for, we'll increase your utilization. And I'll talk about this, especially when it comes to tables and seating. Hold our aesthetic. Aesthetic plays a role in this, and I'll get to this at the end, and I'll kind of talk about how aesthetic plays a role. It's an important role. It's not the overarching thing, but it plays an important role. Essentially, it helps us save money. I mean, really, at the end of the day, if we're buying 100 chairs and we're only using 50 of them, like how does that help? So I think there's, by taking some of these things in consideration, you can kind of stretch those budgets, which I know is always challenging kind of at the university level. So going back to this North Park example, just kind of like dive in a little deeper here. So when we were brought on the project, everything started off as an open space. And this is always becomes like a challenge. It's always trying to find like, what is the right balance that we're trying to achieve here? And this is always the challenge of any space. And I would safe to say, you're never going to hit the middle. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. There's two things. One, it's really complicated. And so you can get close, but things will change over time. So where you could have been at the middle, maybe you're drifting to one side or the other 5-10 years later. But they had this space. It was a large open atrium. Everything was open. They're like, hey, we want to like utilize us more. How do we take advantage of this? They're in Chicago here. It's a city campus. They don't have tons of space just to keep building and sprawling into. So let's put some ottomans in. We'll make it a transitional area. And so, but nobody really used it. The kids nicknamed it the Ottoman Empire. It was just not utilized. So they say, well, we need something with more privacy. And like, yeah, we've seen that lots of times. You put something in a little higher back, maybe wall, make it more comfortable, create a cozy space. Utilization definitely goes up. The downside, I would say here, is that we probably swung the pendulum a little too far. There was not a lot of discussions about like, how do we balance between group and single? So what I don't like to have happen here, and we'll talk about this, I don't like seeing one person sitting in a banquette meant for 3 or 4 or 2 or whatever. That's not the utilization that we're talking about. So really, I think there was some opportunity. How do we hit that middle, more middle ground in there? And in 2015, we were kind of like starting to see this pattern emerge. And so when this project went in 16, we kind of had started an understanding. So there was this early emergence of like, hey, we know we're seeing what really people are gravitating towards, but we haven't quite really understood the balance in there. So they were kind of just a little too early for that. But there was definitely some opportunity of like, how do we try to get that pendulum more to the middle in here? And so for today, when we talk about human behavior, we're going to talk about it from the public space perspective. That's where our expertise kind of lies. We don't really do office furniture. We're designing everything for the public space environments. Our markets are typically universities, public libraries, airports, courthouses, K through 12, all kind of like high use, high durability public environments. And so the reason why we look at it from this perspective, because this is the kind of where people are going to be like the most kind of vulnerable feeling. And so we're going to talk about 3 elements today. One being space, not so much architecture, interior space, which is vital and plays a role in it, but more about the space around us. What does that mean and look like? Talk about this haven, or as in the biofield terms, refuge, creating this kind of haven refuge feeling for people. And then comfort. Won't spend a ton of time on this, but just giving people an idea of like, okay, what chairs go with what chairs go with what product, other product, optimal kind of work patterns, things like that. So we'll talk about comfort more from like the literal sense, not the first half will be psychological and the comfort will be more the physical sense. So the first one, space. We said space. So it's about the space kind of between us in here. And so as we're kind of walking around through our environments, depending on where we are, if we're in our home, in our office, out on the street, in an airport, in a library, at a university, wherever it may be, we have this bubble. Okay. And so this bubble, this invisible force field kind of exists around us. Call it a personal bubble or a comfort bubble, wherever you want to call it. But it shrinks and grows. At home, the bubble can be pretty small, right? Because it's your home, it's your cave, you're with your tribe, your people, you got your food, your warmth, your prospect, your refuge, you got it all there. So your bubble can get pretty small when you're in your space. When you're in a public space, that bubble is going to grow. So, for example, anybody that's an urbanite like me, spent a lot of time on the bus, and here in Chicago, like, I don't know, whatever, it's like right around the holiday, it starts getting super dark at like 4 o'clock. And it's like that week right before a week of like Christmas, you go on the bus to go home, like everybody's already gone on vacation and it's like super dark. So you get on, you're the only one there. Okay. And so it's a little lonely feeling, but it's is what it is. And so as you're going along, the bus stops. Someone else gets on and you don't know this person. Your first thought is always like, oh my God, I don't want this person to sit next to me. I'm like in this environment. I want my space. It's kind of out of the social norm to sit right next to somebody when there's like all open seats. But what do? They sit right next to you. And it's super uncomfortable and awkward. And your mind's going through like, this is now gone against the grain of society. We've all, as a society, agreed that like the norm is like, hey, we leave a space between us, right? We all want to stake out our claim a little bit. So it's a little odd. Or the reverse happens. Someone gets on, you know them, and they don't sit next to you. It can be kind of off-putting. Well, did I offend them? Did I make them upset? Like, or I know them, but they didn't recognize me. How do they not recognize me? So just illustrating that bubble can kind of shrink and grow. In the context of public space, I think what we want to do is think about it as being about 12 inches. Again, you can kind of go, that can kind of shrink and grow, depending on the situation, but just trying to give people kind of the guidance of like, if you're starting to go less than 12 inches, like you're really starting to coach on people's space. And I'll talk about as that goes here. And that comes from like us just observing about like where people will accept and kind of like build barriers to try to keep people away. So 12 inches is a kind of a good rule to think about. So from a table perspective, so it's not uncommon that you would have floors or areas of large tables. And now this is not a play to say, like, get rid of all your large tables. Again, it's always going to come back to balance. But in that balancing, what is the work pattern that you're observing in your space? Do people work individually? Do people work more group? Or is it a 50-50? It could be. So usually I find in institutions, usually it skews a little one way or more, one way or the other. But it's not uncommon that you have a large room and people will say, well, kids love the tables. They love the big tables. They're always at the big tables. Like, well, if you only have big tables, of course they're always at the big tables. So let's watch what they do. So what happens? Someone comes in, what do? Sit right in the middle. Why not? It's a big table. I want to build as much implied refuge as I can. And so they're going to sit at the big table. What are they going to do? They're most likely going to put a bag down on one of the chairs just to kind of stake the claim. Room will hit a critical mass. Then what happens? Well, someone will sit at a corner. Again, you've got, some space here. I'm not looking directly at anybody. I'm probably going to put a bag here, most likely, just to make sure nobody sits next to me. And then again, room with critical mass, what happens? Second corner of the table. And so, this person, if this person already stole that chair, this person's going to put their bag there. And it's not that like we're rude. I'm sure we're all polite people. If the room was busy and someone said, hey, can I sit next to you? Of course. Why not? We're willing to share. But if you look at the natural tendency, it's not uncommon to see this kind of like staggered pattern in here. And so you get this, call it like zigzag. And so a couple of things. One, people are kind of telling you what they want to some degree, because the first thing they do is kind of like, we're humans, we're lazy, we walk downhill. Like it's just who we are. If you think about like all the things that have changed in the last 50 years have all been really just to make our lives like slightly that much easier. Unfortunately, product designers have played a slightly positive but also negative role in that. But that's who we are. We're creatures. We kind of want to make it simple for ourselves. and easy. So when you get into this zigzag pattern, what happens? You lose seats, right? Are you really getting the full utilizations out on these seats? Now it's a tricky balance because you in these spaces, you're going to have peaks and valleys. Like we do have to kind of contend and recognize that. But people are telling you that like, hey, this is what I like to be comfortable in the space. And so the idea is like, well, how do we move and push and pull the product around to not change the behavior, but work with the behavior? So a way to do it is we use a zigzag table, but there's many ways you can kind of do this. Again, it takes advantage. It gives people the space that they like. One downside, this is a footprint intensive product, but it's what people like about 48 inches of work surface to work on, and that much space between them. What's nice about this is it pushes them inside of the work surface, so building up on that psychological kind of comfort, allowing people to kind of sit next to each other without being feeling threatened in there, and you're not sitting across from anybody, so you're not looking anybody directly in the eyes. And so usually when we're doing like things like this, so zigzag is different than a wave. So zigzag being you're going to have a larger radius in front of you, a smaller radius off to either side. And it's not really like a wavy table. When I see these, they look great on floor plans. The challenge is like the person inside the wave versus outside the wave. The person inside is going to always feel more comfortable. So those are going to fill up first. And then if those are really filling up first, how comfortable is someone really feeling? How comfortable does somebody really feel sitting on kind of like the peak of that arc? I would argue probably not terribly because it's like the last seat to fill up. So those aren't really good seating points, but they're really good kind of like collaboration kind of points. I know collaboration is kind of coming up more as students are getting back into the university spaces. Again, there's probably a little more craving to be around other people. So even this is kind of more designed as individually, but it's still a great way to like you're building the space, but you don't have the barriers between, you can still kind of blend the balance between individual and, people working next to each other, as friends or social working, as whatever you want to call it. But same thing can be achieved. So again, it's a deep dive into a zigzag, but the idea is that, public libraries do this a lot where they decide to go smaller. It can be a little more expensive in the short run, but smaller gives you flexibility. It can let you do things like make a quote unquote zigzag, with round tables, and you just use half as many chairs. Or you can kind of flex it, and we do have the extra chairs because we, especially at a public library, like your volumes and needs change just so dramatically, compared to like a university library. And all that's shifting a bit. There's more strains on the university library, providing other additional resources than they've had in the past. That flexibility is becoming more and more prevalent in the spaces. So, but there's other ways to kind of build upon this and build that implied kind of refuge in there. So that's looking at kind of tables from like a top down or kind of plan view perspective. And so when we started this presentation, we're really focused on that because we would see this pattern happen a lot. As we started to do more high tables, which was really interesting, it kind of played into this kind of prospect element that we talked about that does make people build a sense of comfort in there. And so I wanted to make people aware of this because it's another interesting way to kind of change up the space, give it a little different kind of feel, high, low. The high tables are kind of a really great way to kind of build a certain level of comfort and kind of segment off space. So if we look at it from like a like a perspective angle, and we have three different elements in the room. You have someone sitting at a low table, you have someone walking through the space, sitting at a high table. And you look at like more or less, these people are all the same height. Someone standing and someone sitting at a high table are almost at the same kind of eye level, right? They have the same kind of prospect angle. And we know that people being able to survey their environment makes them feel comfortable. So that if you look at someone sitting low, they're already starting off kind of down in there. And then if you think about, okay, now I'm working, so my gaze is now angled down at whatever I'm writing, reading on my laptop, but my peripheral still at a high table, I can still see a good amount of my environment in the space. And so as you're kind of like thinking about it, like the person at the low table, they have someone walking through the space. It's like, you're low, someone's way above. You feel like maybe people are kind of walking over top of you. At that high table, because you have enough of that being able to survey your environment, people will actually sit closer to each other and not feel as compelled to take up an extra seat. Where on the other table, we were saying people are kind of telling you 40, 42, 48, you can start getting like 36, 40, inches in there where people will start to kind of feel more comfortable as they sit up higher. So, if you're dealing with a density issue or something, high tables can be a great way to kind of mix in there. So looking at it from a table perspective, but then looking at it from a seating perspective, again, we spend a lot of time with seating, especially in airports, looking at how seating configurations, again, creating that utilization where it's really common, especially in hangout areas or things like that. You could have a run of seats, and we've all seen it. The airports are the extreme, obviously. Anybody that's traveled recently, you've probably always run into this. You got a seat, someone sitting in a seat, empty seat, somebody sitting in a seat. And then even if there's a shared arm, there's always an empty. But if you start putting that 12 inches in there, in between the arms, you get people to sit there. So one reason's, well, why? That 12 inches, again, not hard and fast rule, but you're starting to build enough of that bubble for people. But two, what do we all have almost at any time? Whether we're traveling or not, what do we have? We have a bag. Where does the bag go? Bag's got to go somewhere. So should it take up 12 inches or should it take up 23 inches or more of the chair? So you have to kind of account for that because people like the bag, as we saw in the North Park example and the University of Florida. People like the bag; they put it right next to them. It kind of makes a good statement, like I really don't want anybody else to be here. We're all carrying our own barriers with us. So if we give a place for it, then it kind of builds on that comfort in there. And so looking at seating, again, starting integrated with panels, you can kind of start to change the dynamic and build those comfortable spaces for people, increase utilization. So one example being 4 chairs around a table. And again, like we talked about, big tables, not an advocate of getting rid of all big tables. They have their place, but what the right balance is. But if you do all 4 chairs around a table, what happens? You have one person to sit, maybe 2 people, but the bags go down. You're losing a lot of real estate and maybe not getting the utilization. Trying to find that balance, maybe using panels in there, spacing, rethinking about those configurations, you can get 4 people to sit in a much tighter space. So it's really common. We do a pinwheel configuration like this in universities. Airports don't like as high of panels. They want a little better sight lines for security reasons. So we do a pinwheel version with tables. And whether you're bringing the panel up to about 40 inches or putting the table and pushing everybody about 12, 4 people will sit in these chairs in here. Because one, you're accommodating, space, potentially for a bag. It's not always best to have on the outside. I get that, but it's a place to put it. You've got some refuge kind of built in with these panels in here. And so you're taking an 80 square foot and down to 30 square feet. So again, if you're dealing with a density challenge of like, hey, I want to create comfortable space, but I need to hit a seat count or something like, yeah, I know only 50 people use my 100 chairs, but I have to have 100 chairs and I want to get more people in there. Well, maybe there's some opportunity of like, how do we resituate some of this stuff to increase that utilization in there and meet that seat count? So that's talking about from a space perspective. And I want to talk about like the building, the haven or refuge element in here. And so where we kind of came across this, started kind of bubbling up in around 14, 15, we were coming out of the trend of like, everything's got to be collaborative and like everybody's buying media stations. And it's like, especially just leaving the corporate world at that time, it's like collaboration means innovation is problem solving, like every corporate buzzword, and then we can synergize and figure out the impossible and, whatever. So again, it was a pendulum that swung pretty far to one side. And then people started realizing, well, everything is a group, everything's collaborative. Um, we're not getting the utilization we want. So what we started to notice, people were not using carols and using more booth and banquette seating. So like example on the North Park and University of Florida example, University of Florida was like early adopters of booth seating in library spaces and things like that. Now they're very common. But you're still getting like one person to sit in the booth. Like I said, not the utilization I would really like to see out of our product and in the space. So what's going on here? Well, what do people like? Where's everybody sitting? Right in the middle of the booth. So we started kind of like, well, why not the carrel? The carrel provides like 3 panels of privacy. You got a panel in front, 2 panels on the side. So why go to the booth seat? Now the booths are, come on, they're comfortable. They got the nice, plush element to it. So that could be it, but there's something else going on there. And so if you look at the carrel compared to like a banquette or something like that, You have privacy, but you do not have security. You don't have your back covered. And so that's really what builds that refuge haven kind of feeling once you cover your back. And it's actually more important to cover the back than the front, if you had to kind of pick in there. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. So we started kind of saying like, well, what do we, how do we do that? How do we make a banquet for like one person, right? That's not a study carrel. So this is where we're like, we got to put them inside the study carrel somehow. So let's turn the study carrel, cover the back, put a work surface in, and now we have privacy and security in there. And that's what starts to build that high level of refuge feeling. And I feel like these types of products are like the pinnacle, like, right, this is the perfect way to build refuge. Now, not always achievable. One, from maybe a space, two, from a price point perspective, not always 100% attainable, but that's okay. You don't need this exact product to always build refuge. You can do it in other ways. One way to do it is, how do we provide spaces where people's backs are covered? And you can do that with movable panels, how you position furniture in the room. There can be a way using some of those, the power bars, where we've seen where, using them single-sided and panels on one side and using the furniture. So there's a number of ways to do this, but covering the back is a great way to build that comfort level for people in the space. Another tricky one that's hard to do, but is important if possible, without doing like a workstation like this, is covering kind of the front of somebody. So what's nice about the carrel, the blinders on the side aren't always as critical. Actually, front and back are more important, because back means nobody's going to come from behind and attack me and try to eat me. But in the front, I'm not getting this kind of like visual disturbance as everybody walks by. I can see in the peripherals on my sides here, I can see what's going on. And I'm still like, it gives me a certain level of connection to the environment. I'm still able to kind of survey the environment. But having that front is the second kind of best way to kind of build that comfort level in there. Recognize me, it's a little harder to do when you don't have like three kind of things connected to each other, or like something like a semicircle like you see here. And then covering the side is always beneficial. And then keeping, kind of connection to the outside with one open panel in there. So I just kind of lay this out here to think, people think about priorities of like how I'm going to try to build space. I want to try to build certain areas that are going to make people feel really comfortable or not overwhelmed, covering the back if possible, covering the front, secondary, and then if you can, the third, one of the sides. And so the same way, we're kind of like looking at panels from a top down or plan view perspective, looking at it more from a elevation view, kind of like the high tables, because we started getting a lot of questions about this. Like, well, let's raise the panels up. Let's increase the privacy, and can be done, but should it? So if you look at kind of like three different panel heights, and we get these questions a lot, you have this kind of like, I call it like zone of security. Somewhere between 39 to 48 inches is a good zone. 39 is a little low. But depending on like maybe where we're at, like in a K through 12 environment, even high school, like you can kind of get away with that. But 48 is kind of a nice sweet spot. One, from a manufacturing perspective, and two, just from like kind of a visual sightline perspective, and then balancing out how people feel comfortable in there. So that's what we call that zone of security. As you go above 48, a couple of things happen. One, you start kind of like encroaching on people here. You're starting to get a negative return on like the cost versus comfort you're getting, especially if you're just going vertically. And then two, think about it from the perspective of someone walking through the space. Back to that, we can't just be concerned about the people sitting in the furniture. People have to get to the furniture too. So that from that prospect perspective, we know that panel equals refuge equals comfort. Well, we also know that visual of the environment equals comfort too, puts people at ease. So if I have to walk into a room and I can't see if anybody's in any of this seating, that creates a problem. So one, or maybe it's like, I don't even want to go in there. I don't want to wander around. And then two, think about, I have to get that much closer to this person to see if somebody's there, thus disturbing them, versus from here, from 10 feet away, I can see the top of their head and see who's working in there. So that kind of 39 to 48 inches is a nice kind of like sweet spot in there. It's a good balance in the panel height. So again, there's a lot of ways to kind of do this, whether you're doing groups or individuals. There's even more products out there, obviously, than what I've shown here today. But we were trying to find that right, like how do we cover the back, the front, the side in there is really critical in building that refuge experience. So last element I want to talk about is comfort here. And like we said, so the first part is kind of more on the psychological side. This is a little more on the kind of physical button back side of comfort. So there's 4 kind of parts into this one where you got a lounge, a work lounge, a long working pattern, a quick working pattern. So looking at the lounge, just giving the people, giving you guys an idea of like lounge is usually more reclined, pulling you into the chair a little lower to the ground. It calls into this like 20-20 rule. So it's probably like, it's not always exactly 20 inches, but just give you an idea. You're going to be 20 degrees back, 20 inches deep on the seat in there. It's going to sit lower to the ground. It's going to want to suck you into that chair. And so in there, with these chairs, these lounge chairs, like the different activities that pair well with them, and it's a little counterintuitive, waiting, like 10, 15, 20-minute activities, a little shorter. So waiting, hanging out, checking phones, checking tablets. We're still really we're reluctant internally to like recommend working in a lounge chair. You're just not in the best posture to do that, especially working usually means having other things there. And I'll talk about this when we get to like the long working pattern. So you're gonna have this quick, and then yeah, lounge. Lounge means lounging around, hanging out. You'll have this like longer activity. Reading is a great one where it's like, yes, I have something, but it's a small something. I don't need to be this over top of a table type posture to do what I'm doing. You know, lounge chairs are kind of great for that. So you got this quick one, and then all of a sudden it leapfrog to like 60, 90-minute type activity. And so if you start comparing that to its cousin, the more kind of pull up side chair here, it's got this 10, 18, 18 rule. So it's much more vertical. So it's got all about the back support. And then it's got a shorter seat and a higher seat in there. So it's going to put you more upright. Again, because you're being paired with a table. So you need to sit in more in an upright posture to be comfortable. And then that should translate into even to your higher table. So really everything just needs to move up. And so sometimes I used to be like, you really got to test the foot rail on these stools. I don't know why people make them lower, but it should be like, shouldn't be any more than 18 inches off the ground. If anything, a little higher. I'm sorry, off the seat, bottom of the seat, shouldn't be more than 18 inches. If anything, you probably want a little higher just so your feet definitely aren't dangling in there. So everything moves up, but it's really still about that back support and short sit in there because it's going with a table at the end of the day. So where some of the confusion, it's less and less these days, but where some of the confusion comes in is when you have this like long working activity compared to like, well, people, I want like a banquette or a plush style chair at the table, right? They're super comfortable. Who doesn't like going out to brunch on Sundays, sitting in the booth, right? Everybody wants the booth. So it's not a lounge chair though, and that's really kind of the difference comes in. And so really what's going on is the booth should share the same proportions as like the side or pull-up chair, not the lounge. The lounge is going to be deeper sit, more recline. So you're going to have to start to perch in there. And so, like I said, it happens less and less where we see lounge chairs paired with tables, but it still happens. And so I keep it in the presentation in here because it's really critical. You're really not building a comfortable space by doing this. If you have to sit and work at a table for an hour and your back's not engaged with the back of the piece of furniture, I don't care if you're 21 years old or 18 years old, it's going to be uncomfortable eventually. And so, because you have this gap in here, so then you're going to slouch and you're going to get a pain in your neck. And granted, as I'm older, I can't work at the couch for more than 10 minutes in my house. Younger, there's much more tolerance in there. But I would argue that like if you're not really providing that back support, it's really going to be hard to focus and make an engaging environment. So in here, these are going to be the longer activities: dining, writing work, computer work, studying. Again, all like all of them have stuff that goes with it. And so this like, writing, computer, studying, you're going to be camping out. You're going to be either bringing stuff or taking stuff over to somewhere, and you're going to be there for a period of time. And so the stuff like in the seating and other tables, the stuff has to go somewhere. So it goes on a work surface. So if you have a work surface, that's where you need that more upright sit in there. And these are going to be, longer activities. People are coming here to kind of camp out. The last one we talked about is this quick one. So it's really just related to high tables. We're not a huge advocate of like standing, like sit to stand tables in public spaces. Great for offices, great for your home office, but moving parts in a public space environment has its pros and cons. Those mechanisms can be very robust. They last a long time. They're not very complicated, but there is a lot of wear and tear on them. So we're more of an advocate, like have some sitting, have some standing, and try to balance it out there. But the standing, not high tables with seats, standing is standing. 39, 42 inches. Again, it's quicker activity. So where are we gonna have quicker touchdown spaces? It's a table, but someone's not gonna pull a bunch of stuff out. Maybe we're already gonna provide the technology there for them to look something up or fill something out or do something. Again, it's kind of a quicker turn space. So thinking about these, looking at a kind of a time scale, like you're gonna have the lounge and standing that are gonna be on kind of one end, and then you have a lounge which jumps out, and then you have the kind of the longer uh, working activities with the work and the work lounge. So thinking about how these kind of interact based on time. And so sometimes I have people, kind of just think about that from like, okay, if we're gonna have an area of high turnover, we definitely don't want to put a bunch of like long-term seating, like booth seating right next to a bunch of like high turnover waiting area. How do we want to segment that? So this is one way, high tables can come into play because we know people will feel more comfortable sitting next to each other. They're at the same eye level as people walking through the space. Maybe it's single-sided, so you're creating this barrier and this divider, um, you know, uh, in there, this implied kind of divider in there, where people will tolerate people walking by because they're at the same eye level, and then protect the people that are sitting low. So there's a number of ways to think about it. So, but think about it from a time perspective. If I have campers here and I have quick turnover here, how do we kind of blend those two and transition those in there? So today we talked about three elements, one being space, like we said, the space around us, haven or this refuge effect. How do we create that? And then comfort. We said like literal comfort, button back, kind of work pattern activity comfort. So the last one I wanted to talk about, like I said at the beginning, is aesthetics. And so the reason why I saved this to the end, but I always want to touch on it, is it's not like one of the building blocks as I would consider, but is the glue that binds things together. So we are creatures driven by aesthetics, whether it's man-made objects, things of beauty, natural beauty, grand spaces. We're aesthetically driven animals, better or for worse. So when we think about a space, like this is the before, I'm sure I can go through here and I can find some places where you can survey your environment, you can create refuge, they probably have the right seating prepared with the right activity, all of it. It's kind of a mess, right? After, okay, well, we've taken the maybe longer term lounge, we move into the window, we know people are going to read there. New carpet, fresh paint goes a long way in a space. Natural light really changes the environment, makes it much more engaging an environment. Again, these were carols or not carols, excuse me, like work areas for people. I mean, it's like, I get it. It's like hard. You got to create work areas. It's probably a really cost-effective way to do it, but it's like, you got some natural light, I guess, but you're still like walking through like a really dark, dingy hallway to get there, sitting in a cage, versus like you could, yes, apples and oranges, but like, look how warm and inviting this environment is. You got this fireplace, these like, again, talking about other biophilic elements, you got the natural fire, the wood, the stone kind of in there. You got this chair that like literally looked like, so like wants to just give you a big old bear hug. They're much, much more inviting, engaging environment. And then comparing the two rooms here, it's like, well, one, sure, you have groups that can meet. It's like open and like individuals, and you got your privacy versus the other room on the right where the groups have a nice comfortable space. They have privacy. Groups need privacy too, but the individuals, you got this kind of wraparound desk in there, panels kind of blocking off peripherals. Weren't able to cover the back, but you have this wraparound trying to build into that, build some of that psychological comfort in there. Make them feel like we're working at Command Central there. Again, very different environment. And so we have these three elements here, and then aesthetics being that glue that binds it all together. And so I usually end with an example. Like I have also background in design, but I have a background in aviation too. And it like I remember learning about aerodynamics in high school physics and things like that. When you started taking more kind of complex classes of aerodynamics, they start talking about, well, you have your high-low pressure, your Bernoulli principle that creates lift. But they don't talk about air molecules. So the Bernoulli principle accounts for about 90% of the reason why airplane wings fly. Well, if you don't have enough density of air molecules, well, it's only 10%, it won't fly. So while aesthetics is maybe a smaller portion that we have to consider, it is still vital and kind of pulls it all together in here. So I want to thank everybody for the time today. Looks like about 10 minutes for questions. I'm happy to answer anything, or if people want to write in, I can answer them later. You can always feel free to reach directly out to me. My email is below here. You can always write into our website. I have, 3 or 4 people that monitor all of our incoming stuff. They are more than happy to route questions directly to me as well. Questions from anybody?
Joe, we have a couple of questions for
Yeah.
you. Will this presentation and slide be available after this webinar?
Yeah, we would be happy to make these slides available if people would like.
Okay. And a second question is, what should be the height from the seat to the top of the table?
Good question. So the seat of the height of the top of the table. So most of our seats are around 18, 19 inches. Chairs that have very little cushion, about 18 inches. Chairs that have a lot of cushion are 19 because you sink down about an inch. And typically a good table comfort is 29 to 30 inches in there. So kind of that space in between. Now, the underside is a little trickier. You want to try to be at least 27 inches off the ground for a couple of reasons. One, it meets ADA. So if you can do that, and most tables should be able to do that, that's a benefit, just universally. And then 2, that allows enough kind of room between your leg, even if someone's tall and likes the chair a little taller or whatever, and the underside of the table in there.
Okay, well, thank you. That's all the questions we have right now. So, Joe, I would like to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this presentation today. I know I always enjoy when you do a presentation. And to our attendees, as always, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. So if there's nothing else, I'm going to give you a few minutes of your day back and wish you all a very happy early weekend.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.